How's it going, everyone? Austin Honecker here. I just wanted to come on here for a while and give my review for Dark Side of the Ring Season 5. Now, Dark Side of the Ring Season 5 had 10 episodes. And here's my review. For episode 1, episode 1 episode 1 was The Ballad of Earthquake, John Tenta. Now, this episode was about the late great Earthquake and how he got his career started in sumo wrestling and how it was too demanding on his body and how he stepped away from sumo wrestling and became a professional wrestler in Japan, and eventually went to WWE, and then went back to Japan, then went to WCW under different names like the Shark, Avalanche and the Shark, and then eventually his real name, John Tenta, and while he was in WWE, he feuded with Hulk Hogan and Jake the Snake Roberts, and then teamed with Typhoon as part of the Natural Disasters. Well, going back to being in WCW, well, after WCW, he went back to WWE and was a part of the faction called the Oddities under the name Golga. And it also talked about how he was a good family man and how he loved his wife and how he loved his children and everything. And it also talked about what he did after he retired from the wrestling business, and talked about how he worked at a mall and a clothing store and then quit, then went to be a truck driver and it ended up with bladder cancer and retired altogether, and then talked about how he was in the hospital before he passed away at 42 years old due to bladder cancer in 2006 and everything. Now, the people who were interviewed for this episode were Jeff Tenta, son of the late great Earthquake, Joanna Tenta, daughter of the late great Earthquake, John F. Tenta, son of the late great Earthquake, Fumi Saito, a wrestling historian, Haku, Josephine Tenta, widow of the late great Earthquake, Earl Hebner, Jake the Snake Roberts, Fred Ottman, aka Tugboat, Typhoon, and the Shockmaster, and Jerry Sags. Now, okay. That was an awesome episode. Episode 2 was Buff and the Bagwells. This episode was about Buff the Stuffed Bagwell. This episode talked about how Buff the Stuffed Bagwell grew up in a wealthy family and everything, and talked about how he was a male stripper and then got approached by Missy Hyatt and got recruited to WCW, and how he debuted under his real name, Marcus Bagwell, and how he teamed with Too Cold Scorpio and then teamed with Scotty Riggs as part of the American Animals, and then talked about how Buff Bagwell ended up switching gimmicks to Buff the Stuffed Bagwell, and how he aligned with the New World Order while in WCW, and talked about how in his personal life that him and his father got into it, and because his father was being an asshole to his mother, and him and his father had a gun war, and he shot his father and everything, and then it also talked about how Buff Bagwell suffered an injury after taking a bulldog, after he jumped off the top rope and took a bulldog from Rick Steiner and broke his neck, and how he was out of action for a while, and then eventually came back. And it talked about how his mother, the late Judy Bagwell, was involved in the WCW storylines and everything. And then it also talked about Buff Bagwell's marriage to his first wife, Tanya Bagwell, and how she was a stripper and how she hated it, and how he agreed to take care of her while he had with his career of being a professional wrestler and everything, and then cheated on her, and they got divorced, and then he got with his second wife, wasn't married to her very long, got divorced, then talked about how he met his third wife, Judy Bagwell, same name as his mother, but that was his third wife's name as well, and talked about how they were married for a while, and he ended up cheating on her and everything as well, and they ended up getting a divorce. And it also talked about how WCW went out of business, and Buff the Stuff Bagwell ended up in WWE for a short-lived period, and talked about his match with Booker T and everything, and then talked about how he went into training with Shane Helms, and Shane Helms was a smart ass to Buff Bagwell, and Buff Bagwell told him if he kept being a smart ass, they were going to have problems. Well, Shane Helms got smart assy with Buff Bagwell again. Buff Bagwell slapped Shane Helms in the face. Then, as soon as Buff Bagwell had his back turned, Shane Helms hit him over the head with a big ass water bottle, filled with a big ass ice cube, and knocked Buff Bagwell out and everything. And it also talked about how Buff Bagwell got fired from WWE due to that and everything. And it talked about how Buff Bagwell was in a couple car wrecks and almost passed away, and it also talked about his friendship with Mark Slick Johnson and everything, and talked about his relationship with his parents and everything, and it also talked about his time when he filmed a few straight-to-DVD movies, and how he was on this reality show called Gigolos and everything. And it also talked about the passing of his mother, the late Judy Bagwell, and everything. And it talked about how he lost everything, and his niece offered him to live with her and everything. And talked about how he went and got help from Diamond Dallas Page to get sober and everything. And it also talked about how he is living the sober lifestyle and wanting to get back in the wrestling ring and everything as well. Now, that was an awesome episode. But, excuse me, before I say that, I've covered that episode. Well, the people that were interviewed for it were Buff the Stuff Bagwell, Steve Bagwell, father of Buff the Stuff Bagwell, Mark Slick Johnson, Tanya Bagwell, first ex-wife of Buff the Stuff Bagwell, Missy Hyatt, Too Cold Scorpio, Scotty Riggs, Eric Bischoff, and Judy Bagwell, third ex-wife of Buff the Stuff Bagwell. Now, like I said, this was an awesome episode as well. Now, episode 3 was Terry Gordy, Final Flight of the Freebird. Now, this episode was about the late, great Terry Bam Bam Gordy, and this episode talked about how the late, great Terry Bam Bam Gordy got his start in the wrestling business at only 14 years old, and it talked about his time with the Fabulous Freebirds, consisting of himself, Michael P.S. Hayes, and Buddy Roberts, and talked about their feud with the Von Erichs, who were Kevin, Kerry, and David Von Erich, and everything. And it also talked about Terry Gordy's time in Japan and how he had to lose weight while in Japan, and talked about how he contacted Richard Simmons to help him lose weight, which he lost a lot of weight, and then went back to Japan and everything. And it talked about how Jimmy Garvin was added to the Fabulous Freebirds and everything, and how Terry Gordy was still with them when he was booked with WCC World Class Championship Wrestling. And it also talked about how Terry Gordy was a party animal, and how he drank and done drugs, and how he got arrested for beating the shit out of a guy in a bar because he was flirting with his wife, and how he headbutt the cop's car and everything. And it also talked about Terry Gordy overdosing on drugs and ended up in a coma for 2 days, and talked about how he couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, and he couldn't wrestle ever again. Had to learn how to do all three of walking, talking, and wrestling again, and how he wasn't the same after that overdose. And it talked about how he wasn't the same as he used to be, and how his wrestling was okay and his punches weren't that good, and everything after that overdose. And before that overdose happened, he was still doing work in Japan and everything. And then but after the overdose happened, he went back into wrestling and wasn't the same and everything. And then it talked about how, well, because he went to Japan and WCW. Well, he went to Japan and everything, and then eventually went to WWE as the Executioner, which was done to protect him because WWE and Vince McMahon were protecting him from ruining his reputation, so they put him as the Executioner. And that was a short-lived time as well. And, well, the WWE stint was short-lived. But World Class Championship Wrestling and New Japan, well, in Japan, were long-lived and everything. It also talked about how Terry Gordy was a family man and loved his kids and everything. And it also talked about how Terry Gordy, well, with that drug overdose, Terry Gordy almost lost his life, but he miraculously survived. But it also talked about how Terry Gordy was found dead in his hotel room and everything, and how his nephew Richard Aislinger found him and everything, and how Terry Gordy's son found him as well. And it talked about how Terry Gordy, the late great Terry Bam Bam Gordy, passed away from congestive heart failure followed by a blood clot and everything. But it also talked about how Terry Gordy couldn't even talk in shoot interviews and everything as well. Now, this episode was awesome. Well, before I say that, the people that were interviewed were Miranda Gordy, daughter of the late great Terry Bam Bam Gordy, Ray Gordy, son of the late great Terry Bam Bam Gordy, Jim Cornette, Mick Foley, Jimmy Garvin, Kevin Von Erich, David Manning, and Richard Aislinger, nephew of the late great Terry Bam Bam Gordy. Now, like I said, this episode was awesome as well. Now, episode 4 was Now, episode 4 was Saving Face, the Brutus Beefcake story. Now, this episode was about Brutus the Barber Beefcake. This episode talked about how Brutus the Barber Beefcake got his start in the wrestling business under his real name, Ed Leslie, then Eddie Boulder and everything, and how he was good friends with Hulk Hogan, and how Hulk Hogan broke him into the business and everything. And it also talked about how he eventually got called up in WWE thanks to help from Hulk Hogan and everything. And it talked about how he was repackaged into Brutus Beefcake and had a team with Greg the Hammer Valentine called the Dream Team and everything. And it talked about how Brutus the Barber Beefcake and Greg the Hammer Valentine split up, and Brutus Beefcake was repackaged as Brutus the Barber Beefcake. And it talked about how Brutus the Barber Beefcake didn't like it, but Hulk Hogan talked him into doing it and doing a sleeper hold and cutting some of his opponent's hair. Brutus the Barber Beefcake done it, went along with it, and he ended up enjoying it. And it talked about how Brutus the Barber Beefcake was parasailing with a bunch of friends and drinking and everything, and it talked about how when he was parasailing, a woman named Tracy was coming up really high with skis and hit him in the face with her skis, and Brutus the Barber Beefcake having to go to the hospital, almost losing his life and having to rearrange his face, having to have plastic surgery on his face, and taking like over 16 hours of it and everything. And it talked about how Brutus the Barber Beefcake went back to WWE for a short-lived time, and then eventually going to WCW under several different gimmicks of the Butcher, the Zodiac, and the Booty Man, but those gimmicks didn't work out. Then he was the Disciple and joined the NWO. And eventually his time in WCW came to an end, and then it talked about how after his professional wrestling career came to an end, he worked at a toll booth like place. Ended up getting fired for cocaine. And it also talked about how Brutus the Barber Beefcake's friendship with Hulk Hogan came to an end, and how he met his wife Missy and everything as well. Now, the people that were interviewed were Brutus the Barber Beefcake, Brian Knobbs, B. Brian Blair, Missy Leslie, wife of Brutus the Barber Beefcake, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Missy Hyatt, Dr. Mutaz Habal, who's a plastic surgeon, and Eric Bischoff. That was an awesome episode. Episode 5 was The Life and Legends of Harley Race. Now, this episode was about the late great Harley Race. This episode talked about how the late great Harley Race grew up in a rough childhood, and how his parents abandoned him at 14 years old, and how he went on a farm to work for a couple wrestlers named Stan and Waldeck Zbyszko on their farm, and how he wanted to train to be a wrestler and everything, and he was broke in by Stan and Waldeck Zbyszko, and then talked about how Harley Race wrestled in carnivals against 5 or 6 guys a night, and talked about how Harley Race was Happy Humphrey's assistant, and how he had to take him to shows and take him everywhere he wanted to go and bathe him and everything. And it talked about how Harley Race broke into the wrestling business and how Harley Race got into the wrestling business and how he lost his wife, his first wife, in a car wreck into a tractor trailer, and how his first wife passed away and he was a young widower and everything, and talked about how he met his second wife, Ivana, and how they got together and how their marriage was and everything. And it talked about how Harley Race was a 7-time NWA world champion and everything, and talked about how Vince McMahon wanted to sign Harley Race, but Harley Race wouldn't do it, and talked about how Vince McMahon tried to take Harley Race down by his legs, and how Harley Race done a front face lock and choked Vince McMahon out and everything. And it talked about how Harley Race was an alcoholic, and how it talked about how he burnt down, it talked about how he went into the WWF building in Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas, and burnt the WWF ring down and everything, and was looking for Hulk Hogan to shoot him and everything. And it talked about how he was a good father to his son Justin and everything. And it talked about how eventually he went to WWE and how he injured his knees and had to have surgery and went back to wrestling, but in WCW and everything, and how his career winded down and everything. And it talked about how once he retired from professional wrestling and everything, it talked about how he passed away in 2019 at 76 years old due to lung cancer and everything. That was an awesome episode. And the people that were interviewed for it were Jim Cornette, Danny Keever, friend of the late great Harley Race, Trevor Murdoch, Ivana Hedbovny Race, ex-wife of the late great Harley Race, Eddie Sharkey, Justin Race, son of the late great Harley Race, Gerald Briscoe, and Mick Foley. Now, like I said, that was an awesome episode as well. Now, yeah, that was episode 5. Okay. Episode 6 was called, now episode 6 was Welcome to My Nightmare, the Chris Colt Story. Now this episode was about the late great Chris Colt. It talked about his professional wrestling career and how he lived the rock star lifestyle, being influenced by Janis Joplin and everything. It talked about his drug and alcohol addiction, and talked about how he was a maniac and everything. And it talked about how he once took LSD and thought that there were giant spiders coming at him while he was in a steel cage match, and got out of the cage beating the shit out of the fans and everything, getting arrested and everything. And it also talked about how he teamed with his boyfriend of 6 years named Ron Dupree and everything. And it talked about how they were together for 6 years. How they were together for 6 years, and how Ron Dupree passed away from a heart attack, and how it hurt Chris Colt losing the love of his life, and everything, and talked about how Chris Colt never recovered from it and everything, and it talked about how Chris Colt ended up retiring from the wrestling business and ended up doing gay porn and everything, and it talked about how he retired and it talked about how Chris Colt passed away in 1995 due to a heroin overdose and everything. Now, that was an awesome episode. Now, the people that were interviewed for it were Jim Cornette, Bill Anderson, Ty Haggard, great nephew of the late great Chris Colt, Rhonda Rondow, niece of the late great Chris Colt, Tom Burke, who's a wrestling historian, Princess Victoria, Edward Giovanetti, and Jack Fritzscher, and Jack Fritzscher, who's a director. Now, this was an awesome episode as well. That was episode 6. Episode 7 was Chris Adams, the Gentleman and the Demon. Now, this episode was about the late great gentleman Chris Adams. Now, this episode talked about how the late great gentleman Chris Adams got his start in the wrestling business. Well, how he done judo first, then professional wrestling, and talked about how he met his first ever girlfriend, Jeannie Clark, and how they had a daughter together and everything. And it talked about how he was always on the road with professional wrestling and everything, and how him and Jeannie broke up, and how he got with Tony, his other girlfriend, and they had a son, them having a son together. And then it talked about how he was temperamental, especially when he was drinking and everything, and it talked about how he was a wonderful father to his children and everything, and it talked about how he about his success in world-class championship wrestling, and also teaming with the late great gorgeous Gino Hernandez as part of the dynamic duo and everything. And it talked about how gentleman Chris Adams was devastated over the death of the late great gorgeous Gino Hernandez and everything, and it talked about his time in WCW, how he was a jobber and everything, and it talked about before he went to WCW how he was in a feud with Stunning Steve Austin and everything, and just talked about his runs with World Class Championship Wrestling and WCW World Championship Wrestling and everything, and even talked about his short stint with GFW and everything as well, and his run with GFW and everything, and it also talked about when he passed away in October 2001 when he was homeless and was living with his friend Boo Ray Parnell and everything, and how he ended up beating the shit out of Boo Ray Parnell, and how Boo Ray Parnell took a gun and shot gentleman Chris Adams and killed him and everything. As well. Now that was an awesome episode. That was episode 7. And the people who were interviewed for it were Jade Adams, daughter of the late great gentleman Chris Adams, Kevin Von Erich, David Manning, Iceman King Parsons, Neil Adams, brother of the late great gentleman Chris Adams, Jeannie Clark, ex-girlfriend of the late great gentleman Chris Adams. The people who were interviewed for this episode were Jade Adams, daughter of the late great gentleman Chris Adams, Kevin Von Erich, David Manning, Iceman King Parsons, Neil Adams, brother of the late great gentleman Chris Adams, Jeannie Clark, ex-girlfriend of the late great gentleman Chris Adams, James Beard, Chris Adams Jr., son of the late great gentleman Chris Adams, Tom Lance, and Brent Boo Ray Parnell, friend of the late great gentleman Chris Adams. Now, like I said, this was an awesome episode as well. Episode 8 was Sensational Sherry. Now, this episode was about the late great Sensational Sherry and how she was a stripper at a strip club, and how she met her first husband, and how they had a child together, and how she wanted to pursue her dream of being a professional wrestler and everything, and how she went and trained under Butch Moore, and then, well, how she left her husband and her husband and 3-month-old child to pursue a career in professional wrestling and everything, and it talked about how she went and trained under Butch Moore for a while, then went on to train with Grizzly Smith and everything, and then talked about how she trained under the Fabulous Moolah and everything as well. It also talked about her career as a professional wrestler, then turned professional wrestling manager and everything, and it talked about how she managed the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, Macho Man Randy Savage, the Nature Boy Ric Flair, Harlem Heat, which are Booker T and Stevie Ray, and everything, and it talked about how she struggled with drug addiction and everything as well, and it talked about her retiring from the wrestling business and getting inducted, it talked about her retiring from the wrestling business and everything, and it talked about when she passed away in June 2007 due to a drug overdose and everything as well. Now, this was an awesome episode, and the people who were interviewed for it were Jim Cornette, Kathy Fitzpatrick, friend of the late great Sensational Sherry, Jake the Snake Roberts, Leroy Gonzalez, ex-husband of the late great Sensational Sherry, Rockin' Robin, Medusa, Jared Gonzalez, son of the late great Sensational Sherry, Eric Bischoff, and Pat Gonzalez, friend of the late great Sensational Sherry. That was an awesome episode. Episode 9 was Enter Sandman, Legacy of a Hardcore Icon. Now, this episode was about the Sandman. This episode talked about how the Sandman grew up to be a professional wrestling fan, and how he got into the wrestling business under ECW, which was Eastern Championship Wrestling at the time, under a surfer gimmick called Hawk, and talked about how he transitioned into the Sandman still under the surfer gimmick, and how Todd Gordon stepped down from ECW and went under Paul Heyman for Extreme Championship Wrestling, and talked about how the Sandman got repackaged into a badass brawler, a badass fighter and everything, and it talked about how his career went down in ECW and everything, and it talked about his feud with Raven when his ex-wife and his son got involved in the storyline and everything, and it talked about how he was having trouble in his personal life with drugs and alcohol and everything, and it talked about how when ECW went under and everything, and how he went to WWE and how his career watered down in WWE and everything, and it talked about and it talked about him starting out as a male stripper and a construction worker and everything before he got involved in the wrestling business and everything as well. Now, this was an awesome episode. And this episode was, this was an awesome episode as well. Now, the people who were interviewed for it were the Sandman, Lori Strzelecki, ex-wife of the Sandman, Sabu, Kelly Fullington, daughter of the Sandman, Todd Gordon, Bill Fonzie Alfonso, Raven, Rob Van Dam, and Tyler Fullington, son of the Sandman. Now, and episode 10 was Black Saturday, The Rise of Vince McMahon. Now, this episode was about Vince McMahon buying out the TBS time slot to keep Georgia Championship Wrestling from airing on TV and everything. And it talked about how it went about and how Jim Barnett was the owner of Georgia Championship Wrestling, and talked about how Ole Anderson, the late great Ole Anderson, ran Jim Barnett out of it and everything, and how Jim Barnett went behind Vince McMahon, how Jim Barnett went and got with Vince McMahon and helped him put Georgia Championship Wrestling out of business and everything. And then talked about how the Briscoes, Gerald and Jack Briscoe, sold Georgia Championship Wrestling to Vince McMahon and everything. And it talked about how the late great Ole Anderson found out and was pissed and everything, and how the late great Ole Anderson struck a deal with Ted Turner to have Championship Wrestling of Georgia, and how Vince McMahon ended up losing his audience and everything and was all pissed off and everything, and how Jim Crockett Jr. bought out the time, how Vince McMahon sold the TBS time slot to Jim Crockett Jr. and everything. And it also talked about how Vince McMahon has rape allegations against him and everything, and stepped down from WWE and everything. Now, this was an awesome episode. And the people who were interviewed for it were Jim Cornette, Dave Meltzer, Gerald Briscoe, Tommy Wildfire Rich, Bobby Simmons, Nick Patrick, Bryant Rogowski, son of the late great Ole Anderson, Louise Cochran, and Bob Roop. Now, this whole season of Dark Side of the Ring Season 5, all the episodes, all 10 episodes, were amazing. I enjoyed them, like I did Seasons 1 through 4. Now, as you know, Chris Jericho was the narrator. Like he's been from Seasons 2 through 4, he was also narrator of Season 5 as well. And I sincerely hope since Dark Side of the Ring has done 5 seasons so far. I hope they do season 6 and many more seasons to go. That would be amazing. Now, now, everyone, I just wanted to come on here for a while and give my review for Dark Side of the Ring Season 5. Like I said, all the episodes 1 through 10 were awesome from start to finish. I really enjoyed them. And with that being said, my name is, all the episodes were awesome from start to finish. Now, with that being said, my name is Austin Honecker, and I will catch your fucking ass down the goddamn road. Peace out.